Well, a little bit interested today. Well, it's a nice spring day. Everything's dying. Not enough water, but that's a different story. Now, I'm interested in looking at how His Majesty's loyal opposition leader, Mr. Peter Dutton, looks like he's going to do a Bradbury at the next federal election early next year. Now currently we have this continuous battle between the Greens, Labor Party, the Teals and assorted independents regarding legislation. And this battle, which has been played up in the legacy media as well as the virtual world, has given Peter Dutton an ideologue. Unlike Abbott, who was a buffoon, Dutton is a right-wing fundamentalist warrior. And what I'm talking about is when you look at the disagreements between the Greens, the Teals and the Labor Party regarding legislation and the policies which are slowly being fed out to the Australian people by the legacy media and virtual platforms, it's become apparent the strategy is to somehow slip through the disagreements, as Bradbury did in the Olympics when most of his competitors fell over and he was able to race to the lead and grab the gold medal. But unlike the Bradbury situation, this is a serious issue, because let's look at the issues that Mr. Peter Dutton, His Majesty's royal opposition leader, is pursuing. As far as workplaces are concerned, let's not forget that one of the first pieces of legislation they'll put through Parliament, if they become the next government, is to rescind the equal work, equal pay legislation, which broke the model which was being used by the Alan Joyces of the world in Qantas and other corporations, where company hire companies would bring in labour at a cheaper rate to perform the same work as workers who were then dismissed. The passage of this legislation through Parliament prevented them from using this tactic to increase corporate profits. So that's one piece of legislation. Then as far as the Construction, Forestry, Energy and Mining Union is concerned, it's obvious that the first thing they would do was set up a construction commission, which many more teeth than the last one, and virtually outlaw workplace activity. That's issue number one. Now, as far as the climate emergency is concerned, now it's well known that many people in the coalition, especially the National Party, have no interest in tackling the climate emergency, because tackling the climate emergency would eat into their profits. And that's why we're seeing the opposition put forward a nuclear-powered future for Australia's energy production, using models and building techniques as far as nuclear reactors are concerned which haven't even been tried, without even bothering to actually place a monetary value on the cost to the Australian people. So while renewable energy gathers apace, whether it's wind or solar or water, we are seeing the Liberal National Party continue to place their faith in the coal and gas industry, because as far as they're concerned, the climate emergency doesn't exist. It's a beat up. let's look at other policies. Let's look at the Israeli policies and their foreign policy, because these are the ones which are the most dangerous. Now, although the Albanese-led Labor government has been trying to steer some type of middle course, the fact is there is no middle course. And as far as the opposition is concerned, as I said before, there is no middle course. The only course forward is wholesale support for the Israeli actions in Gaza, the West Bank, and currently in Lebanon. Full support, including the sale of armaments to the Israeli state. That is their policy. At the same time, they're trying to run on an anti-Semitic platform, as if any opposition to Israeli aggression has anything to do with anti-Semitism. So that's their policies. Now, as far as the United States of America is concerned, it's all the way with the USA. We've seen under the Labor and Liberal Party that the United States military-industrial complex has had a greater hold in this country. Not only do they have bases, we now have thousands of US troops which are in the north of Australia. We have the AUKUS submarine deal, which somehow interlinks our ability to defend ourselves totally with the United States of America. At the same time, you'll see the Dutton-led Liberal National Party pursuing an anti-Chinese policy, as well as pursuing a pro-Taiwan policy. Now, this type of policies means, as we've seen in the past under various Liberal National parties, that if warfare breaks out anywhere in the world, we would be expected to support the United States of America. And let's not forget the United States of America is not only the primary ally in Ukraine, but more importantly, it's the primary ally of the Israeli state. So there are significant differences in policy. Unfortunately, because of the way the legacy media works in this country and the virtual media, what we are seeing is a concentration on effort in expanding the differences between the Labor Party, which is now in government, and the Greens, the Teals, and other opposition forces which are in league. Now, if we continue down this path over the next 6 months, it's highly likely that Mr. Peter Dutton, the Right Honourable Peter Dutton, will do a Bradbury and the Liberal National Party will find itself in government. Not only do we have the problem as far as I said environments are concerned, I mean, these people have no respect for the environment. They would like to tear up the Murray-Darling Agreement. They would ensure that the downward path we are continuing as far as animal and plant extinction is concerned will continue. So there are major policy differences. In France, at the last election, when the Macron-led government saw that they were in big trouble as far as the Le Pen forces were concerned, they formed a temporary coalition with all forces, all progressive forces in that country, and defeated the ability of the far right to gain state power. Because irrespective of what we think, the fact is that we live in a society, we live in a world where the state continues to have extraordinary power, especially as far as social issues are concerned. Then comes the biggest furphy of all, the cost of living crisis. We're told every day the cost of living crisis has something to do with government policy. The fact is, as I've said on many occasions, democracy is rule of the people, by the people, for the people, by an engaged public. It's about creating the greatest good for the greatest number. When you have the corporate domination of the economy and culture and social interaction in this country, it's quite likely that the type of agenda which is pushed through Parliament by a timid government, as we see the Albanese Labor government is, reinforces the power of those corporations to continue to determine parliamentary policy. And when you have a government and an opposition which support corporatisation and globalisation and deregulation and privatisation, you have a major issue. But a greater issue facing us is what will happen if the Liberal National Party does a Bradbury, exploits the divisions which are currently seen by all in order to increase its political representation and ultimately be able to reintroduce conservative policies. Now, the other issue which is quite important is how the how the Liberal National Party sabotaged the voice referendum. Now, what is happening as far as the Albanese Labor government is concerned, and the Greens and the Teals and Independents, is a little bit like happened with the voice referendum, when we saw forces in this society led by the Liberal National Party which have no interest in reconciliation, which have no interest in land rights, which have no interests in overcoming the gaps. Let's not forget that Mr Dutton, when he was a federal member of Parliament, couldn't even bring himself to attend the apology to this country's stolen generations. Now, the opposition believes that they can actually come to power by dividing people in this country, whether it's on the basis of religion, whether it's the basis of race, whether it's the basis of whether they're immigrants or not, whether it's the basis of whether they live in a regional area, a rural area, or a major capital city. Their policies are based on division. And policies which are based on division create internal fracture lines in society which no government is able to control. So we have major issues to face. Now, the Albanese-led Labor government made one critical error when it was elected. It felt that it should have pursued a mildly reformist agenda in order to be re-elected for a second term. What they forgot is the most successful government in this country, as far as reforms is concerned, the Whitlam-led Labor government in the 1970s, didn't wait for a second term. It passed legislation constantly. Now, currently, the Labor Party does have the ability to pass reformist legislation with the support of the Teals and the Greens. It has refused to do so at its own cost. Because if it continues this policy, this timid policies of putting its toes in the water and then taking them out because it's too hot or too cold, as far as public opinion is concerned, nothing will change. It has wasted 2.5 years pushing minuscule reforms through Parliament, believing that somehow, if it's described as a good economic manager that has a surplus, that somehow people will re-elect it. What it has forgotten is this country, the people in this country, are greatly influenced by legacy media. Now, I know most people think the legacy media is irrelevant. The legacy media, especially when it dominates virtual platforms, as we are currently seeing, is able to set the parliamentary agenda on a day-to-day basis. Instead of pursuing timid policies, what they need to be doing is coming together with the Greens and Teals in the last 5 to 6 months of their term in office and pass legislation which addresses, that's right, which addresses the cost of living crisis which we currently have. Now, this cost of living crisis is fully dependent on the creation of ever-increasing corporate profits for a shrinking number of people. Now, it's interesting that in a recent poll, 70% of people would like the government to pursue a more radical agenda as far as economic policy is concerned to address the cost of living crisis. Unless they are willing to take a more radical perspective on cost of living, the climate emergency, the disaster in the Ukraine and the Middle East. What we will see is more of the same. And this government runs the very real risk of being a one-turn government because of the strategy that they put into place when they were elected into Parliament, believing that you need to be in Parliament for 2 terms to make radical reform. Nothing highlights how bankrupt this policy is than what happened during the Whitlam-led Labor government, where reform after reform after reform was pushed through Parliament while they had a majority. And when they couldn't push their reforms, they called for a double dissolution election. This government is timid, and timidity gets you nowhere. This government has been, as they used to say a century ago, Dutchist. That's right, Dutchist, by a small section of society that owns the means of production, distribution, exchange and communications. Its inability to come to any agreement with the Greens and Teals regarding foreign policy, regarding cost of living, regarding the climate emergency, regarding many other issues which we face today, is their Achilles heel. They believe that somehow, if they introduce minor reforms, the legacy media and their virtual partners will leave them alone. If there's one thing we've learnt in Australian history, is that the domination of the parliamentary process by that small percent that owns the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication has been a constant feature of this country since federation. The conservative values which reinforce the power of that small minority is what has maintained their ability to increase their profits and, more importantly, increase the power they exercise over the parliamentary process and the Australian people to such an extent that even a mildly reformist government is to them a threat. This government has, by its timidity, lost the ability to make major change, and if by some miracle they're re-elected with a minority as a minority government with Greens and Teal support, hopefully that timidity will be thrown to the winds. As we saw with the Whitlam Labor government, they continued their reform agenda the second time they were elected. And what we saw is the Governor-General, on behalf of His Majesty, or Her Majesty at that particular point in time, dethrone, overthrow an elected government. So, let's see what happens. But to a significant degree, what happens in the next few months will determine the outcome of the next federal election. And for them to continue on the same timid course, refusing to come to agreements with more radical elements of the Parliament to pass legislation which creates the greatest good for the greatest number, will signal the end of their reign as a majority government. As far as the worst scenario is concerned, the Liberal National Party, led by the Right Honourable Mr Peter Dutton, the leader of His Majesty's loyal opposition, may, like Mr Bradbury, find themselves on the winning dais after the next federal election.